Good afternoon, good morning to everyone across Turtle Island, otherwise known as North America. Thank you for joining us for the fourth session in the series of Catholic Equal Investment Accelerators. We are looking at positive and negative asset screens today. A little bit of housekeeping at the beginning. You've probably already noted that these webinars are recorded for future viewing. They'll be available in a week's time on the YouTube channel of Faith and the Common Good. We have French and English translation or interpretation available today in the webinar. If you hover your mouse over the bar at the very bottom of the screen, you'll see a globe image. If you click on that, you can choose your language of preference, French or English. The interpreter's voice will be 80% volume and the original speaker will be 20% volume. But if you prefer, you can choose to turn off the volume for the original speaker and just listen to the interpretation. We ask that you place any questions you have in the chat box. We have someone keeping an eye on that, and we'll ask that after all of the speakers have had a chance to present. We'll also try our hand today at putting a poll in between the last speaker and the beginning of our questions. At the beginning of every Global Catholic Climate Movement Canada meeting or webinar, we begin with a prayer and a land acknowledgement. I have the prayer up on the screen. You can say it with me. Just keep your microphones muted. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. God of the universe, we thank you for your many good gifts, for the beauty of creation and its rich and varied fruits, for clean water and fresh air, for food and shelter, animals and plants. Forgive us for the times we have taken the earth's resources for granted and wasted what you have given us. Transform our hearts and minds so that we would learn to care and share, to touch the earth with gentleness and with love, respecting all living things. We pray for all those who suffer as a result of our waste, greed, and indifference. And we pray that the day would come when everyone has enough food and clean water. Help us to protect the rights of all people and all species, and help us to willingly share your gifts today and always. Amen. And our land acknowledgement. GCCM Canada shares with the Global Catholic Climate Movement, with Faith in the Common Good. GCCM Canada is a project of Faith in the Common Good, and together we acknowledge that our projects from coast to coast to coast are on traditional territories of diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We seek to live in respect, peace, and right relations, and are mindful of broken covenants. By making a land acknowledgement, we are taking part in an act of reconciliation, honoring the land and Indigenous heritage, which dates back over 10,000 years. As a community, we have a responsibility to honor, care for, and respect all that Creator God gives to provide us with life. This includes land, water, air, fire, animals, plants, and our ancestors. Now, I'm going to just take a minute or two and put into framing why we are talking about investments, specifically investments related to ecology in the Catholic context. I'm sure many of you are aware that Laudato Si was key in bringing many ecological issues to the forefront of our faith thinking. This year, in 2021, we are winding down, actually next week, the fifth anniversary year of Laudato Si. And the Dicastery for the Promotion of Integral Human Development last May published a document that outlines goals that we will embark on as a church community to bring about sustainable production and consumption, ethical investments, divestment from fossil fuels, and any activity that harms the planet and people. We aim to support circular economies and prioritize care, labor, and protecting the dignity of workers. Ecological economics is one of the 7 goals that we are working towards. Last year in March, Pope Francis invited young entrepreneurs and economists from around the world to take part in the economy of Francesco. These young people put together a 12-point statement that is addressed to us, to economists, entrepreneurs, political decision makers, and citizens of the world. 2 of the 12 items that they ask for are listed here around economic ideologies that should never be used to offend and reject the poor, and asking that companies and banks, especially the large globalized ones, introduce an independent ethics committee. These young people acknowledge that our times are too difficult to ask for anything but the impossible. They say we have faith in asking of us what they do, because if they don't ask us, whatever we prepare won't be enough. And to put it in a Canadian context, just 2 weeks ago, with President Biden, Canada announced an increase in their emissions reductions from 40 to 45% by the year 2030, rather than 30%, which it had been earlier. And back in 2016, Bishop Terence Prendergast, Archbishop of the Diocese of Ottawa, said our national and provincial governments must take bold action. We must build an economy that addresses our moral duty to care for the poor, future generations. They need a habitable planet. Now, I'm going to take a minute and introduce each of our speakers. Patrick DeRochie is Pension Engagement Manager with Shift Action, and he has broad experience in policy, research, government relations, and digital engagement. Previously, Patrick was Climate and Energy Program Manager with Environmental Defence Canada. He has a master's degree from the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs and has been deeply involved in developing federal and provincial climate and energy policy and regulations. And he's acted as a commentator in national media. Jason Dudek is a member of the Catholic Impact Investment Collaborative, and he's the leader of their efforts here in Canada. He helped found Mountain Lion Agriculture, which is a business in Western Africa to help people combine sustainable business practices with the needs of their community. And he's recognized as a leader in Canada's impact investment space. Previously, he chaired the board investment committee for the Catherine Donnelly Foundation. And Dr. Lorna Gold has over 10 years experience in engaging faith groups on environmental, climate, and economic justice. She worked with Trocare Maynooth Ireland and developed helped develop the tools to bring bishops of Ireland to declare divestment. She's also acting chair of the board of directors for the Global Catholic Climate Movement and has recently become a member of FaithInvest UK. We have really, really talented and passionate people here today. I'm sure that everyone will learn something about what we can do here in Canada. So at this point now, I'm going to turn things over to Patrick. Thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks for that kind introduction, Agnes. And really glad to be here today. Thanks so much for having me. I'm just going to share my screen so I can share a slide presentation with you. Can everyone see that? All set?
Yes, we can. Yep.
So yeah, today I'll be talking about shifting Canada's pension funds to address the climate crisis. And like Agnes said, I'm Patrick DeRochie. I'm the Pension Engagement Manager for Shift Action for Pension Wealth and Planet Health, or SHIFT for shorts. Today I'm coming to you from Toronto, which is of course located on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credits, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And SHIFT is a charitable project that tracks the fossil fuel and other climate-related investments of Canada's largest pension funds. And we mobilize beneficiaries to engage with their fund managers, calling for improved climate risk disclosure and to shift those pensions away from risky fossil fuels and into profitable climate solutions. A bit about what we're going to go through today in this outline here. And I did just want to put it in context. You know, in the course of any given day, countless critical decisions are made which shape our world and our climate. And like Agnes said in her intro, most of us think of these decisions as falling to political leaders or governments with laws or policies or regulations. But in fact, many of these critical decisions that impact your ability to achieve our long-term climate goals are made behind closed doors by companies or investors deciding where to allocate capital. Each of these decisions ripples across the economy and brings either positive change or locks in climate failure. Trillions of dollars of capital are allocated into infrastructure like roads, bridges, ports, pipelines, real estate, utilities, and companies. And that's why the Paris Agreement, Article 2.1c in particular, mentions the need to shift financial flows as a critical part of global efforts to stabilize the climate below catastrophic levels. And in Canada, the largest pools of that capital are concentrated within our largest public pension funds. The 10 largest ones that I'll talk about today are more than $1.8 trillion Canadian in assets under management, much of it in private equity and outside of the public eye. And these asset owners and managers are at the top of the food chain financially, often holding majority ownership in companies or owning companies outright. And they have huge power to influence and shape our collective future through their decisions. And also just a bit of context, I know this webinar series has had a lot of information on climate risk and the impacts of climate change and the urgency of the energy transition, but I just wanted to show this one graph as some quick review. And I think it just demonstrates that in order to achieve this climate safe energy and economic transformation that's needed, we have no choice but to cut off the root source of the problem, which is primarily fossil fuel production and combustion. We also need to have a discussion about deforestation, land use changes, and other industries, but fossil fuels are the primary cause of this crisis. And first and foremost, it means we need to rapidly transition our energy systems. This graph shows the trajectory that we need to be on in order to stay below that 1.5 degrees threshold of global heating. And as you can see, if we had started 30, 40 years ago and listened to the science and started gradually reducing emissions then, we could have had a bit of a softer curve to get to zero. But because instead we went in the opposite direction and ramped up emissions, we now have an extremely steep decline to go to get to zero and avoid a catastrophe. So we're now on this, this very steep trajectory downward in a very short period of time. And I just wanted to have this situator conversation today because this graph shows that there's a cost to inaction, and we're already seeing those costs today, and there's no more time to waste. And we're not just aiming to reduce emissions, but we are aiming to get to zero by mid-century. So those are the two kind of points I want you to take away from this graph as we move into this conversation. I also am going to talk about a lot of financial risk today, but I do want to just note that there's obviously a moral reason to get our investments out of fossil fuels. We've been doing some work with the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan and Fridays for Future to try and get that pension fund to move away from fossil fuels and really ramp up their climate policies. And for me, this is just a real reason that we need to get out of fossil fuels and start investing in building a climate safe world. So I hope that reason resonates for you as well. And it's really a driving force for me. But today I am going to talk strictly about financial risk and pension funds. A bit of a background, we've kind of put climate risk into 4 categories for finance. One, there's physical risk. This is just the direct impacts to companies, supply chains, infrastructure from the impacts of climate change. So we're talking about droughts, heat waves, storms, sea level rise, wildfires, things that are negatively impacting the infrastructure and assets that make our economy function and that, of course, big investors own. Then there's transition risk. This is the risk of economic disruption due to emerging technologies and changes in the economy. So think about the automobile replacing the horse and buggy in the early 20th century, or Netflix coming and swiping away the business model of Blockbuster, for example. And we're now seeing these transition risks in the energy sector and other economic sectors, with renewable energy becoming so plentiful and cheap and cost effective, replacing fossil fuels, electric vehicles replacing the internal combustion engine, batteries and energy storage becoming quite cheap, and making those traditional energy like fossil fuels less economical and not able to compete in the future. And that's even without considering the risks of climate change. I also just wanted to remind about regulatory and legal risks. So like Agnes said in the intro, we're seeing increasingly stringent, drastic, rapid action from governments to phase down emissions. They're only going to get stronger. They're only going in one direction. We just saw a ramp up from Canada and other countries to increase their climate targets. So things like banning the internal combustion engine, phasing out coal plants, banning new oil and gas exploration permits, emissions reductions across the economy. These are becoming more stringent, and they're going to happen around the world, and they're going to happen faster due to public pressure. Related to that is legal risk. So a lot of these big investors face legal risk from reputational damage, but also direct litigation to oil and gas companies about their business model. We're seeing this from youth, from religious groups, from governments, from indigenous groups that are simply saying that this product is causing the climate crisis. They're misleading investors. They misled the public. And to me, it looks a lot like big tobacco looked like in the 1990s, where this increased legal pressure, this litigation against fossil fuel companies, is removing their social license to operate and changing the public perception and putting investments in those companies at greater risk. And the last category I'll talk about is systemic risk. And this is really when we talk about pensions with a long-term investing horizon, will they actually be able to pay out your retirement savings in a climate transformed world, where we're talking about cascading effects of climate change, like sea level rise, constant natural disasters, mass migration, water shortages. These are real headwinds and drags on economic growth, on GDP growth, on the stability of the financial system in general. So these present systemic existential risks to the ability of pension funds to actually pay out retirees when they're finished working. And the only way to get ahead of those risks is to actually address the root of the problem, which is the production and combustion of fossil fuels. We're not going to be able to pay out pensions to people when they retire unless we get the climate crisis under control. That was a lot of doom and gloom to start, but I did want to talk about the flip side of this, which is climate-related financial opportunity. And a lot of pension funds are recognizing that investments in sustainable agriculture or building retrofits or electrifying the economy, energy efficiency and conservation, renewable energy, clean tech, are providing huge economic returns and really outperforming the general stock market and the traditional energy industry as fossil fuels are in decline. So those are just some headlines exemplifying how successful investments have been already in climate solutions. This graph kind of shows the same thing. This is the S&P 500 list of companies and its performance over the last 10 years. As you can see, economic growth of these companies across sectors, but the poorest performing sector of the S&P 500, of course, was the energy sector, which during this time frame was composed completely of oil and gas companies and utilities. So already over the last 10 years, we've seen an outperformance of the rest of the economy and climate solutions in particular over fossil fuels. And this all leads to this reshaping of the paradigm of finance that Agnes is talking about, that Catholic organizations are now recognizing. Even the biggest asset managers in the world, BlackRock, with almost $9 trillion in investment under management, is recognizing that their clients are demanding action on climate change, disclosing climate risks and getting ahead of this issue. I don't want to make BlackRock out to be a leader on this, but when these huge financial players are even making these demands, it suggests a transformation in the way the financial sector is treating climate risk. I'll move on to what we work on, which is pension funds. And the reason we work on this is because it's such a massive pool of capital. This is a list of Canada's 10 largest public pension funds. You have the CPP at the top, going down to about 23 billion with OP Trust, number 10. And this is over $1.8 trillion Canadian now. So But the scale of this, even shifting 1% of these holdings out of fossil fuels into climate solutions represents a real impact, a real emissions reduction, and real avoided emissions as well. The other point is that these are very highly globally respected funds. They're very influential. They own massive parts of the real economy. They're able to influence and engage companies to improve their behavior, and they have real power to shape the economy. They also own real parts of the economy, so things like highways and bridges and ports and utilities, data centers, railways, real estate. These pension funds actually own significant chunks of physical infrastructure that makes their economy run, and it means that they have the power to change them very quickly. The other reason we work on this is that most of the members of these pension funds are members of unions, of public sector unions, and that gives us a natural ally to work with in engaging the fund managers through working with those unions and their members. And finally, I just want to remind folks that these are our deferred wages. You might not be a member of one of these pension funds, but as Canadians, we're all members of the CPP. If you live in Quebec, you're a member of the Quebec Pension Plan, which is managed by the Caisse de dépôt et placement de Québec. And let's not forget that because the sponsors of these funds are often government departments, ministries, crown corporations, other public institutions, there's also a taxpayer element to this because the public is funding and contributing to these pension funds as well. So not only is this very important to the beneficiaries and members of these funds, but to the public in general because of the taxpayer money involved. A big note on fiduciary duty. Fiduciary duty is for investment managers to maximize the returns of their beneficiaries. It's a legal responsibility. And there's a lot of new legal opinions coming out that showing that fiduciary duty is not a barrier to climate action, but actually requires action on climate change. These new legal opinions show that pension fund trustees and managers have a legal duty to assess and manage the financial risks of climate change. And pension funds in particular with a long-term investment horizon, it means they have an intergenerational equity consideration here where they have to pay out the retirement of a 90-year-old who's been retired for maybe 25 or 30 years, but they also have to pay out the retirement funds of a 25-year-old, say, that's just entered the workforce. So we need to consider that they have a very long-term investment horizon there and a responsibility to all of their members regardless of age. And I'll give an example of that. In Australia last year, a 23-year-old employee of a state government took his superannuation funds to court over this issue because he said, I'm 23, I'm not going to be retiring for 50 years or 60 years, and you're not managing these risks properly. You're still investing my retirement savings in coal. And he took a large superannuation fund and actually forced them to settle and disclose their fossil fuel holdings and better manage these risks and set a net zero target, because they have a fiduciary duty to that young pension contributor. I'd like to show this graph because I think it shows the impact we can have using our investments. On the left here are things that we might do to reduce our own personal footprints. Maybe you want to take less flights or eat less meats or maybe get an electric vehicle, and those are all good things. I want to do those things. I try to make those improvements in my life to reduce my own footprints. But where we can have a real impact is in moving massive pools of money away from the dirty things and into the solutions. And this is just things, yes.
Our interpreter is just wondering if you could speak just a little bit slower. And actually, I have 5 minutes left for you as well.
Oh, sure. Sorry about that. I am trying to get through a lot of info here. There's a few emerging signs of Canadian leadership. So the CDPQ, which manages the Quebec Pension Plan, they've announced they have $36 billion in low carbon assets. They've actually reduced the carbon intensity of their portfolio by 38% in the last 4 years. They have a program that attaches employee compensation to emissions reduction. So there's an incentive across the organization to reduce emissions. Last year, they dumped some of the worst polluters like ExxonMobil as an example. And they also have a net zero emissions by 2050 target. We've seen a similar target from the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan just in January. And they've also made some pretty significant reductions in fossil fuel investments and started shifting those holdings into larger renewables, energy efficiency, and energy storage holdings. But I do want to emphasize that none of these Canadian funds can be seen as global leaders. As this next slide shows, Complete removal of fossil fuels from pension portfolios is starting to go mainstream. Across the financial sector, there's about $15 trillion globally, US, that has divested of some form of fossil fuel, at least coal and tar sands. And we're seeing pension funds starting to really accelerate in this direction. The most notable one I'll point to is the New York State Common Retirement Fund, which is the third largest fund in the US. Just in December, announced they'll divest of fossil fuels by 2025. So this really is not a radical thing for pension funds to do. It is going mainstream, and we want Canadian pension funds to get ahead of this curve. This webinar is about positive and negative screens. So just to note, some of these big pension funds I'm talking about in Canada have no negative screens at all. Others, and I can point to specifics in the Q&A if you're interested, but have screens on tobacco, weapons manufacturers, some companies that violate human rights or international treaties, and some of them in response to public pressure, especially over the Trump administration detaining migrant children at the US-Mexico border, have divested from private prison companies as well. And then in terms of positive screens, we're also not seeing a lot from Canadian funds yet, but the Casa Depot again has low carbon investing targets, and OP Trust, which is one of the big Ontario funds, has a sustainable investing and innovation team that they want to put 1.5% of their portfolio into incubation for climate solutions. Our key asks of funds: an immediate screen on new fossil fuel investments, the phase out of current fossil fuel investments by 2025, decarbonizing that pension portfolio by 2040 at the latest, establishing ambitious solutions or targets, for increasing investments in climate solutions, and then a robust and escalatory engagement policy on climate risk. And that last one's important because all of these funds tell us that they don't prefer divestments and they would rather engage with companies they own because that way they can have more influence on them. And we frankly don't see much credible evidence of that happening in the oil and gas sector yet. And this is kind of a list of questions that we think should be the bare minimum that oil and gas companies should be able to respond to justify continued investment from pension funds. And again, we've asked these pension funds for evidence of this happening and gotten very little in response. So we would say that if they can't address these issues on the screen here, we think that they should be divested from and phased out of their portfolio. And just one more minute and what we're doing. If you go to shiftyourpension.ca right now, you can click one of these pension funds in Canada from a drop-down menu and send a letter using our action tool to key fund managers and risk analysts at the pension funds. We've been, when we get that email, we've also been mobilizing folks to attend AGMs, different pension fund member events, different ways to engage the fund, scheduling direct meetings with fund managers. We do ongoing monitoring of the energy and climate-related investments of these funds. I can provide information about any of them to you in some climate action toolkits we have, if you want to get in touch after this webinar. We also do customized webinars for particular pension fund beneficiary groups. So if you're a teacher or a public sector worker, or you want to learn about the CPP, we can do a customized workshop for you in your group. And we're doing a lot of media work to raise the profile of this issue. And then we're also pushing for some policy and regulatory change at the federal and provincial levels. Just again, shiftyourpension.ca is our action tool if you go there. We have a specific tool for the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan as we're making a lot of progress there. And just a note, one of the big beneficiary groups of them is OECTA, the Ontario English Catholic Teachers Association. So we really want to find ways to get more Catholic teachers in Ontario involved in our campaign. Just some headlines describing the work we've been doing in the media to raise the profile of this issue. And I'll also note this is an organizing tactic. The more we get coverage in the Toronto Star or the Globe and Mail or CBC News, the more we get contacted and build our supporter list in our movement. And I think I'll leave it at that for now. Sorry for talking too fast. I had a lot of information there, but I'm happy to continue this conversation in the Q&A afterwards.
Well, you certainly hit the timing dead on, Patrick. Thank you very much. It was a lot to cover, but you highlighted extremely well. What I was happy to see was that this is normal in other places. I know that these discussions can sometimes be difficult in Canada, but other places in the world are already moving ahead of us in this, and that's good news as far as I'm concerned. So I I will be calling on Jason next, and Jason, Dudek, and I will have a discussion around some of the questions that I sent him earlier. So, Jason, I will begin. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. And my first question has to do with while you were on the board at the Catherine Donnelly Foundation. You were instrumental in helping them make decisions around investment policy. Can you tell us about the experience and the impact it's had on the foundation?
Yeah, my pleasure. So just to be very clear, I'm no longer involved with the foundation, but I was involved from around, I think, 2011 to 2018, if my memory serves correct. So it was an interesting experience because if Catherine Donnelly Foundation is relatively new, so we weren't exactly a sophisticated investor. And at the time I took over chairing the investment committee, our portfolio was actually not doing very well. So the process was initially to get an asset manager who was aligned with our values and familiar with impact investing, who put in place a lot of really, strong screens and aligned us so that we weren't investing in the wrong sorts of sectors or areas. But the really exciting transformation was to take control of the portfolio and start doing direct, deliberate investing along value-based lines. But I guess if there's one influence I hope I've had, it's just the idea of there being a win-win in all of this. As Catholics, we're called to explore not just the ethical side of things, but the efficacy that we can find through social justice. I mean, justice itself is a matter of morality, but also practical effectiveness, right? And so many Catholic social justice principles resonate with that win-win. For instance, the principle of subsidiarity, right? That it's both a moral prerogative for people to be close to the decisions, who are really feeling the outcomes of those decisions, but it's just practical, right? That's a free market, that's a democracy, where the people who are feeling the effects of decisions can be a part of those decisions. So we have this rich tradition, and it's so compatible. And I think there's almost an existential importance in impact investing, because if you start impact investing along the lines where you're sacrificing returns and essentially granting with your investment dollars, it's first of all not scalable. That will not transform the economy. And secondly, especially for a foundation, if you're sacrificing investment returns, it really means you're sacrificing program dollars. So I was proud that, really not mainly because of me, but just because of this outstanding group of folks that I got to work with. We forged one of definitely the most respected and influential investment policies in all of Canada that's been vaunted as a model by the Mars Center for Impact Investment. We were invited to speak, for instance, to Canadian Environmental Grant Makers Network. So it was really effective as a model, and that message of impact investing is both transformational, but ultimately market rate and something that can be done to generate solid returns, as Patrick was talking about, right? I mean, this is a matter of risk to invest in fossil fuels, not just morality. This is a matter of better returns to take advantage of the low carbon transition. So when you start to get in under the hood, so to speak, and explore those areas, you can realize that far from sacrificing the returns, you can actually generate better returns by doing more well thought out, longer term, more value-based investing. And certainly during the time I was there, again, I'm no longer involved, but our portfolio did very well. And even though we were really, really rigorous, both with low carbon investing and just in general impact investing, we did really, really well. So I hope that legacy is still there. And it was really an honor to be a part of it while I was. So.
Thank you. I appreciate what you were saying about Catholic social teaching and thought too. And another one that comes to mind that benefits everyone is the preferential option for the poor. So that's, that certainly comes in line with what we're doing with our investments. What types of investments are trending in the near future that can be used to raise up the integral economy that cares for people and the planet? What positive asset screens might you suggest to people?
So I want to be a little hesitant here about getting into too much detail, and just for the audience to give a bit more background, in addition to sitting on the board of CIIC, I'm also on the board of several other large institutional investment funds. I chair two multinational companies right now, actually, that are both doing very well, that are essentially social purpose organizations.
Can you just tell us what CIIC stands for?
Yeah, sure. The Catholic Impact Investment Collaborative. So it's a global Catholic organization that's essentially an umbrella group for Catholic investors, large and small, looking to whether they're honing their edge like some of our large institutional members or just beginning their first steps. It's just a big community. And we actually have a very apostolic model of growing where it's communities and down grassroots type organization, very much member driven. So we're also working directly with the Vatican, which is pretty exciting. So we've got Cardinal Tuxin is specifically really a big fan of CIIC. So yeah, in terms of what trends are there, I mean, I think Patrick did a fantastic job of outlining this, that people are realizing fossil fuels are risky, and the worse climate change gets, the more risky it's going to be, right? So that's one trend for sure, which I think is kind of obvious. Low carbon economy is, again, a kind of an obvious trend. We want to be investing in the car, not the horse and carriage, so to speak, although I'm not sure if that's a good analogy for a low carbon investment discussion. I think the most exciting trends I see are the integration of investments and programs, which I was just getting into discussing with CDF, Catherine Donnelly Foundation, before I left, but has really been capitalized on by some very prominent organizations where programmatic type granting activities and investments, when they're combined as sort of one effort, the programs can de-risk the investments, and that grant money can be deployed in a way that supports the investments. And also the investments can give a whole other type of scale to the programs. And if it's done right, they're mutually supportive. Obviously, it's a little tricky, but that's an area that is really exciting. And it's not just in grant-giving organizations. You're seeing that with the government too, whether it's through things like social impact bonds or other kinds of combinations of government-type funding or de-risking of certain types of activities in order to enhance the investment side. So I guess blended finance is getting more and more sophisticated. What excites me the most, and what I would say is the cutting edge of impact investment, is place-based investment. A lot of whether there's the large funds, like I sit on the investment committee of a fund that is quite large, and they're able to do this, but also I think it's even more relevant for smaller organizations where you focus on a specific community or even a neighborhood. You could organize, for instance, a place-based investment around a dilapidated church and turn that church from something that is, struggling financially into a whole sort of center for activity and economic development in the community. And it's really, really exciting, not just because the results are tangible and measurable when they're at a small scale, but because you can kind of make like a big push. So investing, say, in a neighborhood or a very specific place can generate a certain kind of momentum where, for instance, if you're taking impact investment and putting $500,000 to do a $100 million fund, it's a little bit more challenging both to see the returns on your investment, but to also sort of, focus that in the same way that place-based investing. This is particularly relevant in the United States right now, where a huge conversation, as I'm sure you're all aware right now, is around racial divisions and how racialized communities are far behind white suburban communities. So place-based is especially relevant in that context, where how do we give a shot in the arm to this low-income neighborhood that's racialized? How do we push the whole community forward? And place-based investing is a really exciting kind of new frontier of impact investment that can do that. So
that's fantastic. There's lots of ideas there. I wonder, can you tell us how you engage with members who want to work with you?
Yeah, so CIIC is very fortunate that we've got a pretty huge global member base at this point. I was about to launch the Canadian chapter right before COVID hit, so it's kind of bad timing, I guess, especially because it's, like I said, a very apostolic model where we're community focused and gatherings are really important. So it's kind of hard to do that. I guess I should take some lessons from Agnes on how to do these webinars and Zoom activities. But because we have such a broad member base, it's really, I have to emphasize this, like peer-to-peer is so effective. If you have a university, like we're working with some Jesuit universities in the United States, and them talking to each other, one university that's farther along than another, it's just a whole different world of potential and synergy than that university talking to like an institutional fund, for instance, or two small foundations, one that's really made a lot of progress, can just learn so much from each other. And so that level of community, and it's why we call it the Impact Investment Collaborative, is really our kind of theory of change, if you will. It's the idea of peer-to-peer learning, sharing in a community of equals and folks who are sort of in the same boat as you, and being able to divide people up into those kinds of groups.
In our shareholder engagement session, we did talk about that and how smaller funds or organizations with smaller amounts to invest can have greater impact when they join a network of people that are focused on the same goals. So it's definitely, I think, what we're seeing in the building of networks and what Patrick talked about earlier about pension funds and how they work. So you talked a little bit about deliberate investing, investing in our homes and social capital, resilience planning. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so this is sort of I guess, with reference to one of the earlier points I made, that in combining different kinds of assets at the table, like you might have your investment assets, but then you might have property or program grants or other kinds of, or even networks at your disposal. The more you combine the things, the more value you can get out of it. So an example I would use, right, if you're talking about impact investments, it can be at a large institutional level, but it can also be as simple as greening up your own offices. It can be as direct as investing in something that's going to not only generate a return on investment, but save costs in another area. And that kind of direct investment is really where impact investment can get quite exciting, because there are different kinds of values. There are different kinds of monetizable goals. You can reduce costs as much as you can generate a return on investment. So aligning, for smaller organizations, it can be really helpful to look at things that way, where, say we only have $1 million to invest, trying to spread it out through 20 different funds is not really going to generate a lot of excitement. And it'll be hard to really assess the impact. But with that same amount of money, especially if you can leverage it a little bit, you could transform a small neighborhood or your own offices, or, for instance, if you're running a housing project and have a center for homelessness, you could put some solar on the roof of that, make sure it's well insulated, especially if it's an old building. And now you're reducing emissions, reducing your costs, and generating, returns. So I think that's one of the messages I would give is, while there is a lot of sophistication, and especially the amazing work Patrick's doing, like, you have to move big blocks of money, so it's not always relevant, right? But for smaller organizations, it can be very much about reclaiming your own capital and reclaiming your agency around your capital, and exercising it as a way to achieve more than just, short-term return financial objectives, but longer-term and medium-term cost savings and really other kinds of value as well.
And I think some of those things that you mentioned, like insulation, maybe not so much, but by putting solar panels on the roof, you're sending a public message to your community about what your values are as well. And that also helps drive conversation and maybe suggest to others that this is something that they might be able to do.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. We moved through those fairly quickly, Jason. Is there anything else that you wanted to tell?
Yeah,
to
well,
tell
I
our viewers?
a question, actually. There's a bunch of questions, so maybe I could answer.
You have time to hit one of them at least. So
yeah, sure. So I'll go kind of bottom up. So there's a question about whether or not the Vatican's divested. This is kind of a funny question, right? And I'm sure as Catholics, we all know there's always challenges with our big administration, so to speak. So it's a mixed answer. Like, in part, certainly the Vatican and obviously His Holiness Pope Francis is calling on organizations to divest. Divestment is a complex topic, though, because it's really, there's different ways of defining it. So like 350.org, for instance, has a list of 200 of the worst carbon abusers, if you will. And so that's their definition of divestment, is getting out of them. But then you can, if you really want to dive deep into it, you can start getting out of banks that are financing fossil fuels, even though that's sort of a step removed. But then if you start linking things together on too many, types of association, almost everything is interlinked with the fossil fuel economy right now. So it's kind of not everything, but you start to get into an untenable situation. So you do need to define it, and that's kind of, I think, the real challenge going forward. What I prefer to talk about with divestment is actually divesting to, and what you're divesting to. And it's kind of what Patrick talked about. Like on the one hand, yes, we have a moral obligation to steward the environment and take care of each other. And clearly there's a lot of risks with fossil fuel investments these days, but just as much as those risks are a motive, so too should the motive be that there's all this amazing low carbon economy type activity out there that is ripe for development. And specifically, like I had a question about the global businesses. I can kind of tie into this. Like I have had the great blessing of founding now two really, really successful, really, really profitable businesses. And they're both in different ways harnessing the potential of low carbon economics. One uses climate smart agriculture, compost and mulch really to support smallholder farmers in West Africa. It triples their income while actually sequestering carbon into the ground because they're using compost and mulch. And it's wildly profitable because it's really effective. The newer venture I started is using a zero emissions cargo drone to bring vaccines and medicines to northern communities in Canada. And yes, it's zero emissions, but by not using fuel, you're saving a tremendous amount of money, right? So there is this direct cost savings involved. So you can look at all of these low carbon arguments as a foundation for profitability and growth. And it's really an opportunity, as Patrick was saying. So you'll probably hear a lot of the same things, I bet, but it's true that, ultimately, again, just taking a step back, as Catholics, we believe God created the world and the world is good. And there are win-wins out there because of this. To be just is to be effective, whereas to be greedy is to be self-defeating. And this is one of the beautiful things about, I feel like, us as Catholics in the impact investing scene is we have this really deep tradition of very well thought out theological and moral values that I think are just a very poignant fit with what impact investing ultimately is. Because again, it's not just a moral issue. It has to be a better kind of investing. Otherwise, it's not going to stick. And it can't be granting with investing dollars as much as maybe some people might want to do that, but it's not going to scale if that's the case. And you're never going to get Patrick's pension funds to jump into an opportunity where they're taking negative returns to feel good, right? I mean, it's never going to happen. So, and it doesn't have to be that way. Whether it's, as Agnes mentioned, preferential option for the poor or the principle of subsidiarity, we have a rich and storied, really, track record, if you will, of proving that to be moral and to be just in the way that we're called to be is to be more effective. And I'll leave you with, the principle of sustainability. Is sustainability a moral value or is it a business value? Well, it's both. If your business isn't sustainable, if you're running a farm and you're destroying the ground that you're trying to farm from, that's not a good business. So, so much of what we're talking about here, it really is about the potential of there being a win-win if we can just look at value a little differently and do business a little bit differently than we have in the past. And this is what we're called to do by the Vatican and as Catholics, but it's also what we should do if we want a better portfolio that's more stable and can generate better returns over a longer period.
Thank you, Jason. You've given us a lot to think about, and I especially appreciate looking at money and finance in a different way, because we have been focused on dollars, but when you focus on people and impacts to the ground that we're on, and ways of using our resources to support those things, then that's also very important. And I'm going to talk about it a little bit at the end because it feeds in so nicely to the work that Faith in the Common Good does. So thank you very much for offering that.
My pleasure.
And now I will leave the floor to Dr. Lorna Gold. Lorna, are you able to share your slides?
Yeah, I'll just get them shared now.
Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Lorna is joining us from Ireland on the call today, so she's 7 hours ahead of us, so heading into the evening of her day.
Yeah. So Agnes, am I just going to fire ahead, or are we going to do the little chat that we
you can go right ahead, because I think
might just fire ahead because I think I'm picking up a lot of threads that Jason and Patrick already introduced.
Yeah.
So I'm going to talk to you a bit this evening or this afternoon for you about the whole journey of fossil fuel divestment from the Catholic perspective, and what happened in Ireland, and then talk a bit about the whole work that I'm doing now with FaithInvest, which links very much to the work of CIIC and other groups. So if I can move forward. I don't need to dwell too much on this part of the talk, really, because we've already heard very much from Patrick and especially from Jason about the call of Pope Francis and the need that's emerging from the science to move away from fossil fuels. Pope Francis is very strident on this topic in Laudato Si, but also in the 2 meetings that he has had with the oil and gas majors, where he has talked about replacing fossil fuels without delay. And in his first meeting with the oil majors, the CEOs actually said that the oil and gas needed to be kept in the ground. This is just the passage from Laudato Si where he talks about the need to substitute fossil fuels with sustainable energy. And this must be available to everyone, including the poorest. Richer countries must help poorer countries to make the shift away from fossil fuels, or leapfrog to cleaner solutions of energy through financing, technology, transfer, and technical assistance. And it's remarkable that now, looking back at those words of Pope Francis in 2015, what he was talking about in many ways seems quite prophetic, given what has happened since in terms of the emergence of the renewable energy market, and also the emergence of many initiatives within the financial sector to help to address, as Patrick talked about, the whole issue of climate risk, make it much more self-evident, because it's always been there, but now it's the whole work to make that self-evident is just gathering a significant momentum. I just wanted to pause in terms of talking about context on one particular issue, and that's has already been mentioned by Patrick, and that's in terms of the regulatory environment in which investments are being made. And there is no doubt that, especially this year, as we are emerging from, or some of us are emerging from the COVID crisis, but not the whole world by any means. But as we're emerging from COVID, as governments are thinking of just the transition, the whole question of what is regulatory environment in which the Paris Agreement can be met, or we can look towards going in the direction of Paris, is very much firmly on the agenda. And as we're approaching the COP at the end of this year, there are a number of major initiatives which have buy-in not only from governments, but also from major players in the financial industry in order to help build the transparency, which means essentially, if we want to, or if we agree to address the climate risks, we agree to go in that direction of that massive steep curve that Patrick showed, we need to radically shift the way that we invest to reduce the exposure to fossil fuels and other causes of climate change. Sorry. So turning now to the Catholic side of this, there's a major divestment campaign which you will know has been a part of a global campaign to divest from fossil fuels. And from this is a toolkit that was produced in 2017, which outlines very much the theology that lie behind divestment from a Catholic point of view, and also the steps that can be taken for institutions to join the divestment campaign. It's very much rooted in the Catholic social teaching, which has always urged us to invest and to use our money judiciously with a commitment to the common good and to addressing the needs of the poorest. And also a tradition I guess what's new about this in terms of Catholics is that through Laudato Si, Pope Francis really enlarged our way of thinking about our connectedness to nature and to into creation. And perhaps this had not been factored in the way that investment policies were made for Catholic institutions. There might have been negative screens in relation to when it came to the unborn child, but Pope Francis presents us with the question of life on earth, of life of all God's creatures. So there's a need for this ethic of life, a consistent ethic that connects all of our thinking in terms of how we invest. And this is very much part of the ecological conversion. And I see it very much as the part of the institutional ecological conversion, community ecological conversion, which Laudato Si calls us to. In terms of the details of the campaign, faith communities make up well over a third of all institutions globally that have committed to divestment. In terms of Catholic organisations, the Global Catholic Climate Movement has led this drive and coordinated Catholic efforts. To date, over 190 Catholic institutions have committed to divest, and GCCM organises divestment announcements. When there's enough new organisations want to divest, a formal announcement will be made. And this year, the divestment announcement is going to be made actually next week during Laudato Si week. So another cohort of Catholic organisations will make their commitment public. And it's a very simple process of signing up. And the window for fulfilling that commitment to divest is 5 years. So the commitment is one thing, and then the practicalities of how you do that is what follows in the 5 years that come up to 5 years. I'm not going to go through all the details of this, but I think you can. I'll share this presentation, and there's lots of links you can link through. And as Jason already mentioned, the divestment movement has in some ways had to be very clear on what constitutes a divestment commitment, because it ranges from being fossil free, which is in a sense the high bar of divestment, to fully divested, partial divestment, divestment from coal and tar sands only, coal only, and then an organisation which is in process of divesting. So when you make your commitment, you start by being in process, and then you can work your way to becoming a fully divested organisation. And this classification has been agreed across all of the institutions that have made divestment commitments over the past 5 years. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the Irish story, because I think that it's certainly it's the one I know best, but it also gives a sense of why divestment matters. So the Catholic bishops divested from fossil fuels in 2018 on the eve of Pope Francis' visit to Ireland. And the Church of Ireland also divested around the same time, as did 10 major religious orders and around half of the Catholic diocese. We've also seen the recent appointment of a Laudato Si bishop in Ireland. And the divestment movement in Ireland played a huge role, the Catholic divestment movement, to a kind of snowball effect in Irish society, I would call it, where Ireland became the first country in the world in 2019 to divest its sovereign wealth fund from fossil fuels by law. And the role of the church in that was not so much the church telling the bishop, telling the state, you must do this, you must lead, but by leading through example, and by the Catholic community joining forces with all the students and with other campaigners to enable the government to make that commitment. And I also wanted to note that at the time of divestment, of committing to divest, there were very limited options in Ireland to make this a reality for the bishops. In fact, their own investment managers did not have a fossil-free fund, but they took courage to make the step, and it shifted the market. There is no question that the decision of the church, the diocese, the religious orders, and the Church of Ireland collectively managed to shift the market, because suddenly they could see that there was an opportunity to have fossil-free funds in the Irish market. I wanted to play a 1 minute, have I got time, Agnes, to play a 1 minute video, which is the announcement of the bishop to divest, because I think that it just to give a sense of how the church was viewed. This was an ecumenical and interfaith gathering on the eve of Pope Francis' visit. It's a 1 minute video.
Go ahead.
Good evening, everybody. This evening, on the eve of Pope Francis' historic visit to Ireland, I wish to announce and welcome the decision of the Irish Catholic Bishops' Conference to divest from fossil fuels. The bishops.
I actually realised I only chose the first opening clip, but I'll put the full video of it into the presentation afterwards, because he goes on to explain why this is important for the Catholic Church to commit, and that this commitment is about being prophetic, being a prophetic voice in the public square, and about joining forces with future generations. So it's a very moving speech that Bishop William Crean, who's the bishop that represents international development for the Catholic bishops. So how did this happen in Ireland? How did we mobilise the church to divest? Well, I think the key thing for us is that we worked with the bishops to help them to build an awareness of Laudato Si, first and foremost, about climate science and how that connected with their financial choices. We proposed and set up a Laudato Si working group, which looked at the implementation of the encyclical across all areas of church life, not just finances. And that's an ongoing process, and we hope we'll gain great stimulus from the Laudato Si action platform that the Vatican is launching next week. We also built a local network of Laudato Si animators in conjunction with GCCM. And that has built up a pool of animated but also well, let's say, informed people in parish life and across all different areas of expertise, including finance, who can help to make this dream of implementing Laudato Si a reality for the church in Ireland. In terms of the lessons that we've learned from engaging with the bishops here and helping the bishops to understand the importance of how this to make this happen, I think the key one for us was that divestment is not an end in itself. It only happens in a faith-based context when you enable ecological conversion, and there's practical solutions, so you make the practical solutions available. And that conversion by its nature involves joining dots for many people that they, including the bishops, that might not be so self-evident even now after Laudato Si. It needs to be explained. We worked alongside their investment advisors to make proposals and suggestions, and to until the point where the divested funds became available. Generating momentum, I think, becoming relationship building with the institutions and finding bishops who can be champions in this area, who are interested, genuinely interested in the area, the gatekeepers, but being a critical friend, taking time to understand and work within the institutions of the church, but also having courage. At several times during the process of getting the bishops to engage and to divest from fossil fuels, it required an awful lot of patience, and at times we had to really push to get, especially to get things in the end over the line. In terms of then, sorry, that's the other way. I'll just take a few more minutes. So the work I do now is very much focused on what happens next. Divestment is really important, but it's equally important, as you will, to look at how do we invest in like full faith alignment, and that this is a long journey. It's not just a Catholic issue as well. So the organisation FaithInvest was created by Work Now to support faith asset owners to create find pragmatic solutions to address faith alignment. Already Jason mentioned just how complicated it is and complex to say invest in this area, invest in that area. It's bigger than saying divest from fossil fuels, invest in renewable energy. It's not that straightforward. So that challenge and all the other challenges that go with that have led to this fantastic new organisation called FaithInvest, which works across all faiths to address the question of how do we shift towards a more sustainable zero carbon economy. So the challenges that come to us are around initiative overload, greenwashing, regulatory industry inertia, ownership structure, lack of due diligence towards the kinds of opportunities that faith investors actually seek. How do you do that? We have
Lorna?
to engage. Yeah.
I just want to let you know you have 2 minutes.
2 minutes, that's fine.
Okay.
We need to focus on engaging those who are actually involved in the investing practices to come together to co-create solutions. It's about co-creation, a bit like the way that CIIC does, with specifically on Catholic impact investing. That co-creation of solutions can involve all faiths, and there's a great richness in how we can learn from each other in different faiths, and a great momentum that comes from working together. So just to kind of conclude, to say that FaithInvest is currently building up its membership platform and portal, and part of the work that we're doing is to look at forming working groups for faith-based investors across many different areas, these ones on the page. Impact investing being one of them, and CIIC are very much involved in those efforts and bringing Catholic experience into that. I'm just going to finish with this to say you're invited. We have our inaugural meeting for members and prospective members on the 8th and 9th of June next online. 2.5 days of insightful discussions on how faith asset owners can mobilise to be more faith consistent in view of people and planet. Practical worship workshops and opportunities to network with other asset owners, managers and advisors. It will be multi-faith, so I guess gives the opportunity to bring the Catholic perspective and the global perspective to bear on the fantastic work that you're doing at a national level in Canada. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lorna. Again, so much to learn, so much leadership that is happening, and the trends are definitely heading in the direction that we want to see. So this is something that we'll be following and hoping that our viewers will really pick up on. Michelle, we are going to try and run a quick poll, and hopefully not take more than 2 minutes to do that. And after that, Lucy will have questions from our audience. Oh, here it is. So I think we have 3 questions total for everyone.
Yes, if you would scroll down and select your answers for each poll. And we'll just take a minute to do this, and I'll give you a 5-second warning. Can you see the results, Agnes?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Okay, I'm going to close the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Okay, and I will read off the results of the poll. The first question was, where are you located? And population base in Canada shows the demographics plays out. Most people on the call are from Central Canada, but we have people from both East and Western Canada and visitors from the United States. So thank you very much and welcome all of you. And maybe sometime before the end of the webinar, if you feel that you'd like to share, please put in the chat box what organization you are representing. Having attended one or more webinars, the next question is, are you inspired to adjust your investment strategies? My goodness, I think we've done a good job. 93% of people said they will be looking at that. So thank you very much. And the last question, would you recommend the recordings of this to others? And again, had very high marks on the positive side. Thank you so much. That's great news. Okay, Lucy, over to you for questions.
Hi all, thank you all very much to the presenters. How is my audio?
Perfect.
So we have a short period of time. Agnes has given me strict instructions. So I have a couple of questions for each of you, and Patrick, we'll start with you. There was a question about whether or not we should conflate pension funds with banks in terms of our climate advocacy work. And, you know, what's the difference?
Yeah, I saw that question, and there's actually a lot. I'm just going to share my screen quick because I wanted to show a graph of some research we did about those 10 pension funds investments in the big 5 Canadian banks. And it showed that at the end of 2020, these Canadian pension funds had about $10.7 billion US held in those bank shares. So there's some real overlap there. And we also found that over a quarter of those pension fund executives were either current or formerly affiliated with those banks at the board or executive level. And over 40% of pension fund board members came from director or executive positions at the big 5 banks. So there's a lot of entanglement between those there. And I just think that there is a lot of bank campaigning happening in Canada, not from Shift particularly, but I would encourage people to check out some of those different campaigns. And the difference with pension funds is that there's a direct beneficiary network there that are members of the pension funds, whereas banks is more of a public-facing campaign where a lot of Canadians, you know, bank at the big 5 banks. So it's a bit of a different model for campaigning, but some of the same tactics would apply.
Thank you. Jason, a question for you around greenwashing. So how did you deal with this problem as a trustee and in your current companies? How do you tell? What advice do you have?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big problem, and it's just going to get bigger as impact investment becomes more pervasive. It's tough because there's different angles to it, but the one overarching solution is to just get more engaged and to not be afraid to ask tough questions of your advisors or of your investees, and ultimately, you know, to look at whether there's a direct or indirect connection between the work of the company or investee. You know, there can be different frameworks for obviously their activity, but whether the work and the impact are directly connected or separate. So a really good example is a solar energy company. Their low carbon impact is direct, But you could also make an argument for an impact investment to an oil pipeline to sort of, do some kind of upgrade that reduces emissions and almost have the same metrics in terms of emissions reduced, right? By sort of increasing the efficiency of a fossil fuel operation. So metrics don't tell the whole story, and there needs to be a clear theory of change. There needs to be a direct connection between the activities and the impacts. And ultimately, I think the simplicity of the impact assessment framework is really important too. This is something that is going forward going to be one of the big challenges with impact investment in general. And just to dig a little bit deeper in this, if I may have another 30 seconds, Agnes, I don't want to be running. So another organization I'm on the board of is a federally funded initiative at a Carleton University called the Common Approach for Impact Measurement. And it's trying to create a common framework that can be relevant across different organizations and sectors for impact investment measurement. And one of the really cool concepts that's come out of there is bounded flexibility, where metrics can't be totally abstract. They need to speak to a broader theory of change, or even better, a broader value set. So often impact investment metrics, according to the Common Approach, are validated through their attachment and their direct address of the UN SDGs. But the really cool thing at CIIC, what we're doing is we're actually creating impact investment metrics out of Catholic social teachings. But the idea, if you have some canon, some value set that the metrics can speak to, that's a really big advantage too, in terms of making sure that there's no, that the metrics aren't, to be honest, too flaky. And I would be very wary of spending money on third-party consultants for impact investing metrics. That can work, but oftentimes, people are making their money by telling you what you want to hear. It's a difficult proposition. Plus, remember, the more money you spend analyzing impact investments, the less your return is. Mm-hmm. If you have to spend $30,000 to analyze a $500,000 investment, all of a sudden that $30,000 is really removing the profitability of the investment. So, yeah, those two things: direct connection between activities and impacts, adherence to a broader set of values, and a coherent theory of change are really important.
Thank you, and that's why this webinar series is free.
Exactly.
Lorna, a question for you. There were some questions in the chat box of, how do we, has the Vatican divested? How do we know what renewable investments are out there? So how transparent are these financial decisions? How do we find out more? Who's tracking it? So if you could just give us a sense of that, that would be great.
So in terms of the Vatican divestment, I think Jason's already kind of touched on that in his intervention. It's a complex picture because the Vatican is quite a few different financial entities all rolled into one, you could say. So parts of the Vatican have divested, like Caritas Internationalis, which is a Vatican agency, has divested. But the Vatican Bank is, as far as we know, is in the process. They have just set up a new ethics committee on the as part of the reforms that Pope Francis has brought in, and certainly divestment is on their agenda. I don't think it's been brought forward yet, but we have firm intentions to engage with them, as Jason is, on this in the coming months in particular. There is a challenge around transparency, and I think it's more an institutional challenge that faith organisations have, as opposed to let's say the divestment decision itself. In terms of divestment, the campaign itself is kind of internationally monitored by 350.org, but there's not a kind of global institutional structure to track how the divestment has actually been followed through at a global level. There are some initiatives using analysis. For example, Arabella Advisors did a study which looked at the fulfillment of the divestment commitments But again, it's very much on a kind of periodic basis, looking to see, are these investment commitments becoming or being followed through, as it's a campaign tool to divest. It's a work in progress in terms of the ensuring that the commitments are followed through. I don't know if I'll maybe leave the question of renewable energy itself. I think what I was trying to say is that in order to invest in a way that's consistent with Catholic values, it's not, and is therefore contributing towards climate solutions, it's not enough to say we switch from dirty energy to clean energy. Removing our investments in dirty energy and fossil fuels is about avoiding harm. That's a basic principle of Catholic social teaching. We do no harm, and we know this causes harm to the planet. So that's one thing, is removing that harm. What you then do to invest in good is a much more diversified kind of exercise. And I think that there's many forms of climate solutions that we could be investing in, and we haven't had time to get into all of that in terms of the missing links in some of this. So you mentioned the economy of Francesco, and some of the initiatives that are emerging around regenerative economy, around circular economy, around cooperatives that are re-emerging as a kind of a new kind of trend. So young people rediscovering cooperatives in the way that they're setting up their businesses. The intermediary organizations and institutions to enable investors to invest in those at scale, I'd say are going to emerge in the next few years. So part of the work that FaithInvest is doing is saying, let's get our heads together and start to invent some of those intermediary structures. Let's create the commingled funds that are needed in order to be at scale investing in those. Let's look at what as Jason said, what our value framework is that makes sense for our faiths, and then put that as a proposal in terms of how we invest. So yeah, that's where we're at.
So I have one more question, Agnes. I don't know if we have time, or maybe I just say what the question is and ask for it to be addressed perhaps after the webinar.
We're at the 7-minute mark. I need about 5 minutes to the end. So that gives our responders an idea of how much time they have.
Okay, so no time. And this is a big question. Strategically, how do we know how to get the biggest bang for the buck in our advocacy work in Canada? Should we be focusing on schools or the bishops, or how do you know how much investment each institution holds, and what's possible? So I don't know, Lorna, was that part of your, perhaps you start about what your strategy was in making some of those decisions, and then we'll move around, and Agnes will cut us off before we get into the meat of it, I'm sure.
Yeah, but we looked for the institutions that have the greatest moral voice. And
interesting.
Kind of, rather than what their investments are, because they all have investments of different varying sizes, but it's the moral voice and the act of switching or signaling. It's a signaling to the market that the shift is having, because the bishops had a cascade effect. So the bishops divested a relatively small amount of their own money collectively. And then they also said, but we are going to advise all our dioceses to also engage in divestment. And we're also going to advise all of the religious orders to divest. So there's the cascade effect immediately. And that's what had the switch. That's what had the societal impact then in terms of the political side of things.
Any advice, Jason, from your end?
Yeah, sure. I mean,
and perhaps in a Canadian context.
I can give a Canadian context also. I mean, negative screens divestment is, as Lorna said, a little more coherent and perhaps, I don't want to say easier, but more coherent. I'm really more interested myself on the positive side, but I can answer with that context. Creating models, even if they're at a very small scale, can be incredibly powerful. Like instantiating change as a model, even if it's so small. I mean, this is part of why place-based investment is really picking up steam. Rather than trying to spread all that impact so thinly, focusing in on a specific location or enterprise or endeavor that can then become a model and demonstrate to others not just that impact investing works and create positive change, but it can also be profitable and generate stable, sometimes even above market returns. That's really powerful. That's really powerful. And I think that's part of this momentum we're seeing, that people are starting to realize, doing good is good for business. So creating a model of that is sort of the first step.
That's a great note to end on, and I'm going to have to stop the questions here. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to share my slides. Let's see here. Okay. Can everyone see that? Oops, sorry, I'm going to have to scroll down. Sorry about that. Okay, I'm going to make you all dizzy. Okay, here we are. So, in Canada, there are 6 or 7 Catholic organizations that have publicly declared through either 350.org or through the Global Catholic Climate Movement that they are in the process of or have already divested. There are many other faith organizations in Canada that have done so, and some of them have agreed to be mentors for anyone who has been following this forum who would like to speak to them on a peer-to-peer level. And if you are interested in that, please reach out to us. I'll show our email contact in just a few minutes. Also, this is not going to be the end of the conversation. During the summer, we'll be pulling together all the information from each of these webinars, as well as adding in more information to create an investor toolkit that will be a digital toolkit available online through GCCM Canada. And Lorna, we're definitely going to be looking closely at your document and using it as a model. Here are some action items that people viewing today can pick up and look at right away. So there at the top line is the email address to contact GCCM Canada if you'd like to be involved in the mentorship program as a peer learner. Some of Patrick's tools to engage directly with your own pension fund are provided here, and they'll be available in the chat. I'll be putting this together as a follow-up resource page after the webinar as well, to go out when the recordings go out. CIIC has a pledge, and you can look that up, and you can choose whether or not that is a good match for your organization to join that pledge and become involved that way. Or similarly, Lorna outlined the different scales of divestment that are offered through the Global Catholic Climate Movement. And then, of course, this is the invitation from Lorna to FaithInvest's inaugural meeting. It sounds like there'll be some amazing conversations that will evolve from there. This is how you can get in touch with both Faith in the Common Good and GCCM Canada. I wanted to again thank Jason in particular for suggesting other ways of pointing your investment dollars aside from actual capital investments. Faith in the Common Good has a website with a lot of free material, but we also have networks of people working on exactly that. Faithful Footprints is with the United Church, and they have a grant body that will help churches with capital expenses to making their building more energy efficient. So that's everything from upgrading furnaces or insulation, changing windows, that kind of thing. So the Faithful Footprints is a program to look up. Greening Canadian Mosques is also a program. So much of, in fact, all of Faith in the Common Goods programs are interfaith by design. So the Greening Canadian Mosques is relatively new, and we're really excited to have them part of the programming. Faith in the Common Good has for many years provided an energy benchmarking program. In Ottawa, it's really taking off right now. And what this involves is tracking the energy use of your building and then working through suggestions to improve that and showing how the improvement is both saving congregations money and reducing their greenhouse gases. There's all kinds of wonderful material through Faith in the Common Goods website, and I encourage you to take a look at it there. Finally, there are many, many, many people to thank as part of this program. It's been very rich in the partnerships that we've developed, but we have to thank first and foremost the Catherine Donnelly Foundation for funding the activities that we are doing around investment. And I personally have to thank everyone at Faith in the Common Good for their technical support and for supporting GCCM Canada and being our parent for our technical information and our administrative. We couldn't do it without you. So also a big thank you today to all of the speakers. You've brought a wealth of knowledge to us. Thank you also to Alice, who has done our French interpretation today. It's a big job. There was a lot to cover. Lastly, thank you everyone who's participated in this. We hope that we hear from you and have a chance to collaborate with you again around faith investing. Once more, it's been a wonderful series, and I encourage everyone to dig into some of the materials that we will provide to help you move forward on your plans that way. Thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure being part of this. I hope you all have a great rest of your week. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.